When I was a kid, the Dino Ferrari was a peasant car. I can remember going to a car show because long before there were cars and coffees, we just had normal car shows, cruise nights, things like that. And there was a model car place near my dad's office. That guy would host little car shows, and he owned a 246 GT. There's two things about that encounter I'll never forget. Number one, I looked at the car and I loved it, and I ran up to it and I wanted to look at it, and the guy said, "Get away." That solidified that pretty much everyone with a Dino was an asshole. Granted, I was 5 years old, so it was one data point. And two, my dad looked at me after that encounter and he says, "Don't worry, kid, it's not a real Ferrari, it's just a Dino." So because of that, I grew up kind of missing out on one of the greatest Ferraris ever built. And that's a mistake that we make with a lot of classic cars. We don't appreciate them until suddenly their values start to skyrocket. Look at air-cooled 911s. There's always been petrol heads who are after an air-cooled 911, but I probably didn't care that much about them until they started to become more mainstream, until people like Magnus Walker started showing us that, like, damn, these are legitimately cool. Once again, this video is not sponsored, but it is brought to you in part by the lovely folks who have donated on Patreon. See the link below. Thank you so much for your support. And around the same time I had that encounter with the mean Dino owner down the street, those cars were probably $25,000, $30,000, so you could just go get them. People who own Dinos today have owned like 10 of them, and they've bought and sold and bought and sold them. But now that our humble, not a Ferrari, Dino 246 GT fetches between $350,000 and $400,000 for good examples, we're listening. So why am I talking about a Ferrari? Because I drove one and I loved it. The car I'm talking about is actually on Bring a Trailer right now. That's why I drove it. I did the drive video for this car. And typically I don't talk about the cars that I drive when they're up for sale, but I hate nothing about this car. Everything is incredible. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Appearances are subjective, but if you think the Dino's not a beautiful car, then just get out of here. The thing is incredible, and when you approach it, you open the door with this beautiful little latch, and you are rewarded with the best click. The best click in the automotive industry. I mean, honestly, no one's told me about that. Everyone always talks about the doors on Porsche 911s. The Dino click is really good. And now you're scouting the interior for how you're gonna get into the car, how you're gonna sit. And you notice that the seats and headrests are actually separate. They're not connected. The headrests are on the chassis and the seats are on the floor. It's kind of funky and they're different color. I love that touch. So when you get into the seat, there's two things that become unbelievably apparent. Number one is that you're gonna get to play with the coolest gated manual gearbox like ever. It's so beautiful, and you grab a hold of the shifter and you're just, if you're a car guy, like, it doesn't get much better than this. I don't think anybody could look at that shifter and be like, yeah man, sorry, I'm a muscle car guy. No, you love it. You just love it. And the second thing is, where the is this steering wheel sitting in relation to me, a human being? It sits between your legs. There's a video of Derek Hill, whose father was the great Phil Hill, driving a 250 GTO, I think Series 2 car on Petrolicious. This was published almost 5 years ago, and it's one of the greatest 7-minute chunks I've ever spent in my life multiple times watching. It's something that I don't even need to watch it. Sometimes I just put it on in my house and listen to this engine, because they closed down this road in the Pacific Northwest, I'm pretty sure, and they just ripped on this car back and forth up and down this road. And it's incredible, but the thing I noticed the most about this car was where he was sitting. I mean, Derek Hill's a tall guy, I think, and his hands are like in his knees. He's driving like this. When I got into the Dino, I started driving and I thought, oh my God, getting caught up in this car sideways would be very scary. But most importantly is the sound of that V6 engine. And the fact that it's not a 12-cylinder Ferrari is exactly why it's a 6-cylinder Dino. Let's talk history. I feel like I'm giving a book report, but okay. Alfredo Dino was Enzo's son, and he died at the age of 24 of muscular dystrophy. So, as a commemoration of his son, Enzo created the Dino mark, which was going to be a place where they could create cars without V12s, so V6s and V8s, that apparently were actually somewhat designed, the V6, by his son Dino. And these were gonna be kind of budget Ferraris. They started using these engines in race cars, but then they eventually made their way into the road cars and finally into the iconic 246 GT and GTS. The GTS is the Targa. Now, if you really want to nerd out on these old Italian cars, this is the subject to pick. You choose like kind of off-brand cars. So whether it's like Dino Ferraris, Pizzarini, ISO, all these crazy small or sub-brands have the craziest stories, and each car is a little different because their assembly lines had rolling changes. So you might get a different bumper configuration, steering wheel, knockoff wheels, not knockoff wheels, headlight covers. It's bonkers. And actually, if you go to the Bring a Trailer website and start reading all the comments, one guy even commented about the windshield wiper bolts. Are they painted? Are they not painted? Like, this is the level of insanity that these guys go to. It's remarkable. It's fantastic. And I won't claim to know any of this. It would be like me trying to tell you that you have poor grammar and you're Elvish from Lord of the Rings. Like, who knows this stuff? But there are people who do, and it's very commendable. But what I'm concerned with is the drive. Listen to this thing. So admittedly, I didn't get to drive this car exceptionally hard. The point is to just prove that A, it runs, and B, it's solid, it's put together. You know, what you're selling is in fact what you're claiming it to be. And as a driver, I get very nervous about these cars because I've never driven most of the cars that I drive for Bring a Trailer. Clarification, I do not work for Bring a Trailer, but people hire me to make video content so they can use that video content when they sell their car on Bring a Trailer. But it's certainly intimidating to jump into an Italian car from 1969, a Euro spec model, kind of not even knowing what it's really worth, and just going out and trying to look expert rowing through the gears because these cars are always a little finicky. Anything old is intimidating to drive, especially as a manual transmission, because you've got to make sure that you're hitting everything just right. You don't want to grind a gear. You want to make sure that gearbox is warmed up properly. You don't want to crunch a synchro because you were too quick on the shift. Frankly, the Dino was less of a challenge than I thought. But the real point of this discussion is that you need to experience some vintage cars. There's different levels of vintage. I mean, look, you could go to a 1911 Benz, or you can go to a 997. I mean, honestly, at this point, pretty much anything's considered vintage as long as it's not completely computer controlled, even though those cars are mostly computer controlled, but we kind of give them a pass because they have hydraulic steering racks, which is like, okay. The price of entry can seem daunting. I mean, I certainly can't afford to buy a Dino or anything relatively close to that, but what you can do is buy older cars that haven't really seen this massive appreciation. Porsches were in that bubble for a long time. You could buy like a 70s SC for pennies. I mean, these cars were like $15,000. They'd be sitting on someone's lawn. You just couldn't give them away. At that price point, it was certainly daunting because you'd buy a $15,000 car knowing that that engine would cost you like 20 grand to rebuild or replace. So if anything happens, you're upside down on this thing. But that's where the passion needs to supersede the logic. Anyone who kept their $25,000 Dino is laughing all the way to the bank today, or so you'd think. They probably aren't. They're probably just keeping their Dino because they love it. I have to concede though, it's not all fairy dust and rainbows when you drive these cars because they can be leaky, they can be loud, they can be smelly, they can break. Parts on these cars can be very difficult to find. That's kind of the beauty of the 911 world, is because most everything in a Carrera air-cooled car is going to be replaceable. You can go on Pelican parts, you can order stuff online. Whereas if you've got these Italian cars that had rolling changes on the assembly line and you're looking for like this one thing, it can turn into a fiasco looking for a tiny baby part that was super bespoke to your car, and it needs to be this color, it needs to be original from the factory. You can't just go to Home Depot and grab a screw and boom, now your taillight's back in. No, you need to find the period correct item. Which is why when I drive these cars, I'm hyper vigilant. I'm super paranoid. In fact, I was out in a DB AR1 the other day, and this pickup truck just ran a red light. And you can see, I had him in my sights as he was coming down the hill. I rolled off the clutch and just did not give it any throttle because I wanted to know, is he really gonna do this? And he did it. You can't have road rage in these cars because if you get mad, you'll drive angry. You can't drive angry in these cars or else you might mess it up. There's an old adage, if you have to get somewhere by a certain time, that's not the adage. Only drive the cars if you want to drive, not if you have to be somewhere. Because you have to be somewhere, now there's pressure, and you might take different types of risks that you wouldn't normally take with, say, a Countach or a Dino. It makes these cars almost therapeutic because you've got to be patient with them. You can't force anything with these vintage cars, which is why, honestly, I'd be very afraid to let a lot of people who've only driven modern cars drive my old 911. A lot of young people know how to drive a stick shift. That's not that hard to learn, but not everybody knows how to be patient with a car and let the car ask for the gear, wait for things to come together, and also be able to abort a situation if you think, ooh, that might have been a misshift. And every car drives a little bit differently, so it's very rewarding to be able to operate this car. It's like a musical instrument. It's like every guitar is a little bit different. And doing these Bring a Trailer shoots can be kind of intimidating when it's a guitar I've never played before, because you basically need to be able to take that guitar and show it off to the experts who are gonna pay $400,000 for it. So I put up a longer version of that drive on Winding Road magazine, and there was a comment that really stood out to me. And it said, if a modern pickup truck hit you in that car, you'd be dead. And they're 100% correct. These old cars, not safe. That's why they're not really good daily drivers, and the people who drive them all the time, whether it's like old 911s or old Ferraris, are total savages, because they're basically saying like, yeah, I drive on the highway every day in this tin can, whatever happens, happens. But to be honest, if I did get hit in that car and the cameras weren't rolling to completely prove that I was not at fault, even if they were, I kind of hope I'd be dead. I don't think I'd really want to face an owner and say, hey, I cracked up your Dino while I was at a stop sign a mile down the road. You've got to be hyper vigilant and aware of everyone around you so no one hits you, but you've also got to be calm, collected, and smooth so you can drive the car, because that's really the objective, drive the car. So look, am I telling you got to go out and spend $300,000 on a Dino? No, I mean, if you can, by all means, go do the thing. But there's more to cars than speed, and sometimes that gets missed because we look at numbers constantly, especially on the YouTubes. We race things, but you could go out and find a challenging experience, a gearbox that you've never driven before, maybe an old Volkswagen Beetle. There are still cheap vintage cars that are tricky to drive, or at least unique to drive. And it can be both very rewarding and very frustrating to find out whether or not you've got the chops to drive these old things, because you might think driving your manual Audi A4 is like, yeah, I can rev match downshift, I can do all this stuff, but when you get into an old car that doesn't have all of the technology packed into it to make sure that A, the driver doesn't destroy the car, and B, it's very driver friendly and easy to drive. They're engineered to be easy to drive. Some of these older cars, they're just like, yep, it works, put it in. They'll figure out the rest. They'll know if it grinds, they'll learn how to adapt to it. And that's the beauty of driving vintage cars, is adaptation and finding out, like, can you make it sing? So thank you so much for sharing the passion with me, and liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Don't forget to respect the drive, and I'll see you in the next one. Is the wind noise bad?